The ballroom smelled like money and old secrets. I noticed the scent first: beeswax candles, hothouse lilies, something cedar dark underneath the perfume of 100 expensive women. Before my eyes adjusted to the light, chandeliers hung 3 stories above my head, dripping crystal teardrops that caught every candle flame and scattered gold across the marble floor in patterns that shifted whenever the room moved, which was often because there were a great many people in the room and all of them were expensively in motion. Velvet ropes in deep burgundy cordoned off the display tables, where antique pieces gleamed under directed spotlights. A Georgian brooch, a set of Art Deco cufflinks, a Victorian mourning ring with a lock of hair sealed under glass. These were mine to inspect. Mine, meaning my employer's. The small antique restoration studio where I worked quietly, tucked between a dry cleaner and a bookshop on the kind of street that tourists never found and regulars were grateful for. I was not a guest. I was very, very aware of that. The invitation slip in my bag read vendor access, jewelry inspection, and display maintenance. It was pale blue, printed in a font that probably cost more per letter than my lunch. The borrowed black dress I wore was my roommate June's, taken from the back of her closet with her blessing and a string of increasingly alarming style instructions that I had mostly ignored, except for one directive involving my posture that I kept remembering whenever I felt the chandeliers judging me. I had pulled my hair back neatly. I wore flat shoes that were technically formal but designed for standing, because I was going to be standing for hours checking clasps and counting stones and making sure nothing valuable had shifted during transport. I did not belong here. That fact was not painful, exactly. It was simply true. The way the distance between the moon and the earth was true. Measurable, permanent, and occasionally beautiful to look at from a distance. I worked my way around the velvet ropes with my small kit bag over one shoulder, nodding to the silent security guard stationed at the display entrance, who had already checked my credentials twice. The ballroom was filling up slowly around me. Women in gowns that cost more than 6 months of my salary. Men in black tie who moved through the crowd as though gravity applied differently to the wealthy. Champagne flutes caught the light. Someone laughed at something that was probably not funny. A violinist in the corner played something that felt vaguely familiar and faintly sad, which was one of those elegant combinations that made me wonder if the wealthy had sorrow specially tailored too. I focused on the jewelry. I was good at that, focusing on the small, real thing in front of me when everything else felt overwhelming. A bent prong on the Georgian brooch needed noting. A chip in the enamel of the Art Deco cufflinks, minor but worth flagging. The mourning ring was perfect, heartbreakingly so, and I spent an extra moment looking at it, thinking about the person who had worn it and the person who had been reduced to a lock of hair inside a glass bubble and all the years between the two. History made compact, made portable, carried on a finger. It was that kind of sentimentality that made June say I was in the wrong century. She was probably right. Rain had been falling all evening against the tall ballroom windows, making the city outside vague and luminous, and whenever someone opened a door, the smell of wet pavement came briefly through the perfume and hothouse flowers, like a reminder that the actual world was still out there, doing its uncreated thing. I found that comforting. I had finished the main display and was working through the secondary pieces, items destined for the silent auction rather than the centerpiece tables, when I needed to use the powder room. The nearest one was down a quiet corridor off the ballroom's east wing, past a row of oil paintings that looked like they had witnessed several inheritances and at least one dramatic death. The corridor was dimly lit, hushed, carpeted in burgundy that swallowed sound. My footsteps disappeared the moment I stepped onto it, which was its own small comfort after the ballroom's constant murmur. I found it on a small table beside the powder room door. At first, I thought it was a prop, a piece left from an earlier display, or perhaps a reproduction left by a careless vendor. Then I looked closer. The chain was platinum, heavy and fine, made with the kind of precision that machine production cannot replicate. The pendant was a diamond cluster, oval-cut center stone surrounded by smaller marquise diamonds, arranged in a crescent shape, like something caught mid-fall, suspended in silver-white light. It was breathtaking. It was, I was almost certain, real. Someone had left a fortune in a corridor. I stood very still for a moment, because that is what I do when I am frightened. I go quiet. I held my breath and looked at it, and felt the peculiar tightness of a moment when you understand fully that a choice is being asked of you. Before we return to the story, I just want to share a quick note. This version is made for YouTube, but the uncensored GL scenes and hotter videos will be available on my Patreon. Some moments are too spicy to include here, so if you want the fuller and bolder version, you can find the details in the description below. I thought about what I would feel like, in 10 years, looking back at this corridor, at this choice. I thought about my mother telling me when I was 7 that a found thing is a test, not a treasure. I thought about how easy it would be to slip it into my kit bag and tell no one, and how I would never, in my whole life, be able to do that. Not because of consequences, but because some things are simply not possible when you are the particular person you are. I picked it up carefully. The platinum was cold against my fingertips, the diamonds catching even the dim corridor light and scattering it into small stars across the ceiling and the wall. It was heavier than it looked, which fine jewelry always is. Density is one of the ways value announces itself honestly, without performance. I turned it in my hands for one more moment, then carried it back toward the main hall, looking for any face of authority in the glitter-thick crowd. A staff member, a security uniform, an organizer's lanyard, someone with a radio. I should have found a staff member immediately. I should have gone directly to event management, to the front desk, to anyone official. What I did instead was carry it back toward the main hall, holding it visibly, not concealed, scanning the room for a responsible face while the crowd moved around me, and that was when everything went wrong. I had the necklace in both hands, offered, not hidden, held like something precious being returned to its shelf, when a woman in silver chiffon turned and saw me and stopped completely. Her name, I would learn later, was Margot Devereaux, and she was the kind of woman who thrived on knowing things first, and on the particular social power that information gives when wielded at the right moment. "That's the Moonfall," she said. Not to me, to the room. Loudly enough to carry over the violin, over the murmur of conversation, over the careful ambient noise of an expensive evening. That's Celeste Ravenshaw's mother's necklace. The name meant nothing to me then. The reaction it caused meant everything. Heads turned. Conversation died in concentric circles outward from where I stood. A man in a tuxedo to my left took a step back as though I had produced a weapon. The event security guard who had checked my credentials twice materialized from somewhere to my right, and his expression had shifted entirely, from professional boredom to professional suspicion. "Miss," he used the word like a hand on a shoulder. "Can I ask where you found that?" "In the corridor," I said. "Behind the powder room. It was on the table beside the door. I was going to return it to the organizers." "She had it in her bag," said a woman I had never seen before, somewhere to my left. "I absolutely did not." "I saw her," said another voice, somewhere in the thickening crowd, and I turned to find the speaker and could not locate them in the press of expensive, turning faces. I had not had it in my bag. I had been holding it in 2 open hands since the moment I found it, and I was still holding it in 2 open hands. But there is something that happens to truth in a crowd of people who have already decided what they believe. It becomes a very small thing. It becomes almost nothing. It becomes a voice saying the same thing repeatedly to a room that has stopped listening. The security guard had a radio now, and was speaking into it with the quiet urgency of someone calling for backup. A second guard appeared from the other direction, coming from near the main entrance, and the geometry of the room arranged itself around me in a way that made leaving feel theoretical. I was not physically restrained. I was simply surrounded by the particular pressure of collective certainty, which is its own kind of restraint. I found it in the corridor, I said again, to no one in particular and everyone at once, because I had nothing else to offer but the truth, and the truth was not going well for me. I was bringing it back. I work for Artisan Recovery and Restoration. I am here as a vendor. I have credentials in my bag. I checked the display pieces earlier this evening. I have never in my life. Then why do you have the Moonfall Diamond in your hands? Asked Margot Devereaux, and her voice was soft and terrible with satisfaction. The question was not a real question. It was a frame. The answer would not matter, because the picture was already painted. Woman in a borrowed dress with a priceless necklace, caught in the light of 200 expensive witnesses. I opened my mouth. I had no answer that they were willing to hear. I closed it again, and then the crowd parted. She did not push through it. She moved through it the way water moves through dry sand, without effort, without apology, leaving a path that closed behind her as though she had never been there at all. Celeste Ravenshaw was tall, with dark hair worn up in something architectural and unforgettable. A gown the color of midnight tide that caught no light and gave none back. She was perhaps 34. Her face was still in the particular way that still things are not peaceful but contained, as though a great deal of energy had been organized into absolute composure and was holding its shape. She had eyes that were some shade between gray and blue, the color of sky before a storm decides what it intends to do, and they moved from the necklace in my hands to my face with the precision of a jeweler assessing something unfamiliar. The room did not go quiet because of drama. It went quiet because she had walked into it. I understood in that moment what it meant to be the kind of woman everyone watches without meaning to, the kind whose presence rearranges the room the moment she enters it, not because she demands it, but because the room adjusts automatically, the way light adjusts when something is placed in its path. "Explain," she said, not to me at first, to the guards, to Margot, to the room. One word, and it emptied out the noise like water poured from a glass. Margot Devereaux gathered herself visibly. "We found her trying to leave with the moonfall. Your security—" "I found it in the corridor," I said clearly, over her. I was shaking, I noticed, the fine tremor of adrenaline working its way through my hands and my knees, but my voice was not shaking, and I chose to use it. On the table beside the powder room door, I was returning it. I have been holding it in open hands since the moment I picked it up. I did not take it from anywhere, and I was not trying to leave. Celeste Ravenshaw looked at me. The guards looked at her. Everyone looked at her, because she was the hinge on which this moment would turn. She crossed the last few feet between us at a pace that felt measured, not hurried, a pace that said she was not alarmed, but was paying close attention, and stood close enough that I could smell her perfume, something dark and cold and very faintly floral, like a garden after snow, and looked at the necklace in my hands with an expression I could not entirely read. There was grief in it. There was recognition. There was something careful happening behind those storm gray eyes. She said, very quietly, "Where exactly was it?" "On a small table to the left of the powder room door," I said. Perhaps 4 feet from the door frame, it was sitting at the edge of the table. Not in a case, not wrapped. Just placed there, as though set down in a hurry, or left deliberately. There was no one else in the corridor when I found it. "And you picked it up." "I picked it up," I said, "because leaving it there seemed like leaving a child alone in traffic." Something shifted in her expression. Not much, perhaps only visible to someone standing as close as I was, close enough to see the texture of stillness. A small, involuntary thing, like the first crack in very old ice. She reached out and took the necklace from my hands. The room exhaled collectively. For a breath I thought, "It is done. The necklace is returned. I will be escorted out politely or impolitely, and I will go home and tell June everything, and she will make tea and swear on my behalf at length and considerable volume. And this will become a story I tell carefully for years, because no one will believe the whole of it. But Celeste Ravenshaw did not step back. She looked at the necklace in her hands for one long moment, the way you look at something you thought you'd lost. And then she looked at me, and then she did the most astonishing thing I had seen in my 27 years. She stepped around me. Her fingers found the clasp with the ease of someone who had performed the motion many times. The platinum chain lifted. The weight of it settled against my collarbone before I had fully understood what was happening, and Celeste stepped back around to face me, and the Moonfall Diamond necklace rested against the hollow of my throat. Cold and impossibly heavy and brilliant, even in the warm light of the ballroom. A crescent of falling diamonds suspended at my neck in a borrowed black dress. I could not speak. The room was also silent, but differently than before. Before, the silence had been the silence of accusation. This was the silence of witnessing something no one had expected. Celeste looked at me with something in her face that I could not read, and did not yet have the vocabulary for, and said, in a voice that carried, because she did not need to raise it, "A woman who returns diamonds when no one is watching deserves to wear them where everyone can see." Margot Devereaux made a small sound that was not quite a word. The guards exchanged a look and did not move. I stood with the Moonfall Diamond around my neck, wearing a borrowed black dress in the center of a ballroom full of people who had all just watched Celeste Ravenshaw make an announcement out of me, and I thought, I have absolutely no idea what just happened, but I am relatively certain my life has changed in some fundamental way that I am not yet equipped to process. She turned to the room with the particular quality of finality she seemed to carry always. The necklace was misplaced. It has been found and returned by a vendor with impeccable honesty. The matter is concluded. She looked at Margot for a long, flat moment. "I trust you'll all have a pleasant evening." And she turned back to me and said quietly, so that only I could hear, "Come with me." She did not make it a question. The side door led to a private lounge, dark-paneled walls, low lamps, a sofa in cream leather, a bar cart with bottles I did not recognize, but that looked important. It smelled like old paper and cedar, and the faint trace of someone's cigarette from several hours ago. Leather-bound volumes lined one shelf in a way that suggested they were actually read. A painting on the far wall showed a woman standing in a garden, looking away from the viewer, which felt appropriate to the room. The door closed behind us with the soft, expensive sound of something well-built. I expected, now that we were out of view, for the mask to drop in the other direction, for her to become cold in a different way, more efficient, for her to explain crisply what she required from me in exchange for the protection just performed. Money to stay quiet, a signed statement, something transactional to balance the dramatic gesture. Instead, she went to the bar cart, poured 2 glasses of something amber, and held one out to me. I took it because my hands needed something to hold. "Sit," she said, not unkindly. I sat on the edge of the cream sofa and tried to look like someone who regularly found themselves in private lounges wearing historic diamond necklaces. The moonfall was still against my throat. I had forgotten it. For approximately 30 seconds, in the adrenaline of the walk, here and now, I was acutely aware of it again. The weight of it, the cold of the platinum, the way the central diamond caught the lamplight and made a small bright point in my peripheral vision. "You're shaking," she said, sitting across from me in an armchair that seemed to have been designed for her particular quality of composure. "I was accused of theft in front of approximately 200 people," I said. "I think shaking is appropriate." "It is," she said, and there was something in her tone that might have been approval. She looked at me with a directness that was neither aggressive nor social, but simply attentive. "What's your name?" "Liora Bennett. I work for Artisan Recovery and Restoration. We were hired for the jewelry inspection and display maintenance tonight." I have credentials in my bag. I can show you. I checked the main display pieces at 7:30 and the secondary pieces between 8 and 9. I have documentation. I know, she said. I reviewed the vendor list before the event. She settled back slightly, the amber glass in her hand. Tell me again exactly where you found it. I told her. The corridor, the table, the placement. The way it had been sitting at the edge without any case or packaging, as though set down in haste or placed deliberately where someone would find it, in circumstances that could be made to look guilty. She listened with the kind of attention that made me feel she was not just collecting facts, but arranging them into a pattern she already partially understood. How long was it there, do you think? She asked. I can't say precisely. I passed that corridor about an hour before I found it, and it wasn't there then. I would have noticed, but I was only looking briefly, going toward the powder room. An hour, she said almost to herself. A pause developed. I looked at the amber drink I hadn't touched and decided that this was probably not the moment to develop new opinions about whiskey. Is the necklace important? I said. Beyond its obvious value, I mean. She looked at me for a moment as though she was deciding something. Not whether to answer, I thought, but how much of the true answer to give. It belonged to my mother, she said. The room became very quiet, in a different way. A real way. It's called the Moonfall because she wore it the night she met my father, Celeste continued, her voice even and precise, stripped of ornament. At a charity gala, coincidentally. She said the chandelier light caught it in a way that made the diamonds look like they were falling, and she kept the name because it suited the feeling of that evening. She wore it to everything that mattered afterward. She was buried without it, at her own request, because she wanted it to go forward instead of down. I did not say anything. Some silences deserve to be held, not filled. My mother had known that too when she was alive, which is perhaps why I recognized it. I don't carry it often, she said. I brought it tonight because it was the foundation gala, and she started the foundation. Someone knew it would be here tonight. A pause. Someone made a plan. I understood what she wasn't saying. You think it was placed deliberately. I think it was moved deliberately, she said. Whether the goal was theft, embarrassment, or something more specific, I don't yet know. She looked at me again, steadily, with those storm gray eyes that had stopped deciding and were simply observing. But I know that you found it and returned it. And in my experience, that is rarer than any diamond. I looked down at the glass in my hands. I would like to take the necklace back, I said quietly. It feels very wrong to be wearing it. It looks right, she said, and there was nothing flirtatious in it. She said it the way one might describe a painting in its correct frame. Observational, declarative, which somehow made it worse, or better, or something else entirely that I didn't have a category for. But of course. She came around the low table between us, and her fingers found the clasp at the back of my neck. A platinum hook closure. I knew the style. I had repaired 7 of them. And she worked it with the ease she had shown in the ballroom, except here there was no audience, and it took slightly longer, and her fingers stayed at the back of my neck a half-breath past the moment the clasp released. Light and warm against my skin. And then she stepped back, and the weight of the necklace lifted, and I was ordinary again. Thank you, I said. No, she said. Thank you. She did not say it like a social nicety. She said it like something she had waited a long time to say to the right person. June was waiting up when I got home, which I had expected, and she was wearing the face she reserved for when things were extremely interesting, which I had not entirely expected. Tell me everything, she said, before I had taken off my shoes. I want it in the order it happened with full emotional annotation, and do not skip the necklace part, because I saw it was the Moonfall on the event social media, and half the comments are already calling it iconic. I sat on our secondhand sofa, rescued from a closing estate sale 3 years ago, upholstered in faded blue that June called heritage chic, and I called comfortable. And I told her everything. June made sounds at appropriate intervals. Genuine shock at the corridor, real fury at Margot Devereaux delivered in 3 languages, hushed reverence at the necklace fastening, and a prolonged silence at the end that meant she was actually processing, rather than simply assembling a response. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" said June. It was not a question. "She's terrifying," I said. "Those 2 things," said June, with the air of someone making a very old observation freshly, "are not mutually exclusive." I did not sleep well. I kept feeling the ghost weight of the necklace against my collarbone, and the ghost warmth of Celeste Ravenshaw's fingers at the back of my neck, and I lay in the dark and reminded myself firmly that I was a jewelry restoration assistant with a studio kit and sensible shoes and a secondhand sofa, and she was a woman whose surname was on the sides of buildings, and that the gap between those 2 things was not romantic tension, it was geography. And geography did not become navigable simply because someone had briefly touched the back of your neck in a private lounge while taking back their mother's necklace. By morning, I had almost convinced myself. Then the call came. The studio line. 8:47 in the morning, which was 47 minutes before we officially opened. And my employer, who was deeply formal and not prone to sentiment or early phone drama, who listened for 30 seconds and then held the phone out to me with an expression I had never seen on his face. "It's for you," he said. "Specifically you. She asked for you by name." I took the phone. "Liora Bennett? Miss Bennett?" The voice was calm and controlled and recognizable even through the phone's compression. "This is Celeste Ravenshaw. I have several pieces that require professional attention. I've been informed that your studio does exceptional restoration work. I'd like to bring them in." I was aware of my employer watching me from across the room with the careful curiosity of someone who has just realized a small thing has become significant. "Of course," I said. "We'd be happy to—" "Yes, we're open from 9. "I'll come at 10, she said. "Thank you." She hung up, clean and direct and complete. My employer looked at me for a long moment. "Celeste Ravenshaw," he said, as though confirming something in a catalog that he had previously been uncertain belonged there. "Apparently," I said, and went to put the kettle on. She came at 10, and she came alone, which struck me as significant because women like her generally moved with attendants, assistants, security, someone with a schedule. She wore dove gray today, a wool coat of that particular shade that knows it is expensive and does not need to announce it. And she carried a small leather case with the careful grip of someone transporting something irreplaceable, which she was. I took her to the back workbench, which was the truest part of our studio. Good overhead lighting designed for detail work, a magnification lamp on an adjustable arm, trays of tools arranged in the order I used them, the faint smell of metal polish, and the soft cloth I kept folded at the edge. Most clients stayed in the front reception area. She came straight to the bench without asking if she was allowed. The way people who own things tend to move through spaces they are evaluating. It could have been imperious. On her, it was simply direct. She set down the case and opened it. 3 pieces: a Victorian brooch, seed pearls set in gold, with a hairline crack in one of the petal settings, a pair of garnet drop earrings in silver, with a clasp on the left one that had bent slightly inward, and a bracelet, wide and flat, alternating onyx and moonstone in a geometric pattern with one small moonstone missing from the 3rd row, leaving a gap like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect sentence. I examined each piece with my loupe. I asked about provenance, age, any previous repairs I should know about. She answered precisely, with the knowledge of someone who had been told these stories and retained them not by obligation, but because they mattered to her personally. Her mother had worn the brooch to her own wedding. She had chosen pearls because her mother before her had worn diamonds, and she wanted the line to move, not repeat. Her grandmother had brought the earrings from somewhere east. She was not certain of the city. The bracelet was newer, 10 years, no more. A gift from herself to herself on the occasion of a birthday she had spent alone, which she offered without self-pity, the way one states a fact that has been integrated. The brooch is the most pressing, I said. The crack in the pearl setting is superficial, but progressive. If it's worn without attention, the pearl will split along the line. I can stabilize and reinforce the setting without altering the original style. The clasp on the earring is a straightforward correction. I can have it done before the end of today. The bracelet will take longer because I'll need to source a moonstone to match. This cut and opacity aren't common, but I have contacts who specialize in period stones. She nodded. She was looking at my hands rather than my face. You work quickly, she said. I work carefully, I said. It sometimes looks like quickly from the outside. Something that might have been a smile touched the edge of her mouth and did not commit. It happened and was withdrawn so smoothly, I almost doubted I had seen it. There's something else, she said. I looked up from the brooch. I've spoken with the event organizers and with my legal team. The placement of the moonfall in that corridor was not accidental. We're reviewing the security footage now. You were not accused in good faith last night. And I want to be certain that nothing connected to that situation follows you professionally or personally. I set down the loop and considered her. I appreciate that, genuinely. But I also need to ask, what exactly did I step into? She was quiet for a moment that had texture to it. Not hesitation, but evaluation. The rain outside the window had decided to be serious today, steady and gray, and it made the studio feel more insular than usual. A small, warm cell of good light and old metal, while the city was wet and indistinct beyond the glass. My father's estate came to me 18 months ago, she said. Not without resistance, and not without ongoing efforts to question the arrangement. My stepmother Odette has interests that depend substantially on my being seen as unstable, distracted, or unfit. If the moonfall had disappeared at the Foundation Gala, if there had been police involvement, a scandal, questions about my judgment in bringing it, questions about the event's security under my management, it would have served a specific purpose in a specific argument. And I disrupted that. By being honest when the setup required you to appear guilty? She looked at the bracelet on the cloth. Or when it assumed someone would take it and be caught. Either version of the scheme required the necklace to create a problem. Your honesty transformed it into a different kind of statement. I just didn't want to leave a diamond necklace on a table, I said. I know, she said. That's exactly the thing. She looked at me then. Directly, without the guarded filtering she had used in every other moment I had observed her. And I understood that she was lonely, in the way that people who are always watched are lonely. Not for company, for someone who saw what was actually there, rather than what was convenient or useful or frightening about it. I looked back steadily and did not look away, which surprised us both. She returned to the safer language of business. I'd like to hire you directly for the restoration and assessment of other Ravenshaw estate pieces. The collection is substantial. 3 centuries of acquisitions, several estates worth of accumulated heirlooms, and a current archivist who has management training rather than specialized jewelry knowledge. I'll pay above market rate and provide transport to the estate when pieces can't be moved safely. I'll think about it, I said. It was not what I had intended to say. I had intended to say yes immediately. But something in me, some small, careful instinct, wanted one moment of deliberate pause, wanted to have chosen this, rather than simply fallen into it. She seemed to understand. Take the time you need. She left her pieces and her card. I watched her car pull away through the rain-spotted studio window, sleek and black, and I turned back to the Victorian brooch and the hairline crack in the pearl petal, and I thought, be careful, Liora. Be genuinely, thoughtfully careful. I called June at lunch. She came to the studio, I said. A long pause. She came to you. Ostensibly for restoration work, and non-ostensibly. I looked at the card on my workbench, the name in clean dark type, the phone number I had already memorized without intending to. I have no idea, I said. That's what worries me. That's also, said June, what sounds very much like a beginning. I said yes to the consulting arrangement. Of course I did. The work was genuinely interesting, which helped justify it to myself in the honest accounting I kept. The Ravenshaw collection was extensive and varied, spanning 3 centuries and 5 countries, and the aesthetic preferences of 8 different women who had each been part of the family in various ways and had each left their mark in metal and stone and silk-wrapped boxes. It came to me in installments, delivered by a quiet assistant named Piers, who handled everything with the kind of discreet efficiency that suggested Celeste ran her world the way she ran herself. Cleanly, precisely, without unnecessary gesture. She came herself often, though, which was not strictly necessary for the work, and which neither of us mentioned as a fact worth examining. She would arrive in the late morning, stay for an hour or two, ask precise and informed questions about whatever piece was on the bench. She had clearly read everything she could find about each item's period and style, though she never performed this knowledge ostentatiously, and occasionally in the spaces between technical discussion, tell me things. About her mother, slowly, the way one opens something that has been long closed and checks for damage at each degree of opening. About the foundation, which her mother had started with the belief that art was not a luxury, but a form of language, and that some people had been systematically prevented from speaking it. About the estate, which was beautiful and cold and full of rooms she had not opened since her father's estate. Proceedings had made every room feel like contested ground. I told her things too, more than I intended. It happened gradually, the way warmth spreads in a room when no one is specifically tending a fire. You don't notice it until you're already inside it. I told her about my mother's ceramics, modest and precise, which had never shown at any gallery because modesty and ceramic studios occupied different civic spaces, and my mother had been made to understand that early and had accepted it in the particular way that graceful people accept small unfairnesses, by working anyway. I told her about the job I had before this one, cataloging estate sales, and how I had ended up in jewelry restoration by accident, and how the accident had turned out to be the thing I was made for in a way that almost nothing else in my life had quite been. I told her about the ex, not his name, not the specific shape of his dismissal, just the contour of a man who had found my honesty charming until it became inconvenient, and my modest life attractive until it became a limitation. I had carried that quietly for 2 years afterward, the way you carry something heavy when you're not sure yet where to set it down. She listened with the same quality she brought to everything, as though collecting and arranging, building a structure she could stand in later. "You think you're a consolation prize," she said once. We were in my studio, late afternoon, the light going copper through the rain-spotted glass, and I had been talking about something else entirely. About a piece in the collection, a Georgian locket with an interior hinge I found particularly beautiful, and she had arrived at that sentence from somewhere I hadn't seen coming. I kept my eyes on the locket. I think I'm realistic. You think they're the same thing. I set down my tools and looked at her across the workbench, this woman who was all controlled elegance and inherited authority and careful composure, and I said, "Don't you? Have a version of that. Something you believe about yourself that has nothing to do with evidence?" She looked at me for a long time. "Yes," she said. "I think I'm unsustainable. I think that eventually everyone who comes close enough gets worn down by what it costs to stay." I didn't know what to say to that, and then I did. "So we match," I said. "Both of us convinced we're too much and not enough at the same time. That's either very sad or very funny." Something happened in her face, not the almost smile from before, something larger and less guarded. She caught it and held it still, and I watched her do it. Watched the small, disciplined effort of containment. And that small, careful act was somehow more intimate than anything that had come before. She was letting me see her hold it. She took me to the Ravenshaw estate in November, when the trees along the approach drive had gone to late autumn gold, and the house presented itself through the windshield with the particular stillness of something that had been standing long enough to have opinions about time. It was, in the honest accounting, extraordinary. But the extraordinary thing was not the architecture, which was all tall windows and stone and a quiet insistence on permanence. It was the quality of attention Celeste brought to it. The way she walked through rooms she owned with a kind of careful acknowledgement, as though the rooms held memories she was choosing to carry rather than being crushed by. The archive room where I worked was on the second floor, north-facing for the even light, which was exactly right for assessment work. She came in the afternoon with tea and sat in the chair in the corner while I worked, which I had told her she was welcome to do and which had become a kind of agreement. She would come, I would work, we would talk or we would not talk, and the silence when it came was the comfortable kind, rather than the performed kind. She told me about her mother in that room, in pieces, not as a presentation, but as things that surfaced naturally when the right object came to hand. The pearl brooch I had repaired had been worn at her parents' wedding because pearls, her mother said, were the only jewel that came from a living thing trying to smooth an irritation into something beautiful. She thought that was a very good description of marriage and also of art. The mourning ring in the auction case, not the estate's own, but one her mother had bought for herself from a private sale, had appealed to her because she found it honest. Grief as an artifact, grief as something made and worn and kept, rather than something merely survived. She collected things that were honest about what they were, Celeste said, from the chair in the corner, a cup of cooling tea in her hands. She had no patience for pretense in objects. She felt that objects, at least, owed you the truth. Unlike people, I said. Unlike people, she agreed. I looked up from the piece I was examining. She was looking at the window, at the November garden below, the stripped trees, the boxwood hedges that held their shape year-round because some things are built for constancy. Her profile in the afternoon light was the kind of thing that would have stopped me in a museum. Not beautiful in a soft way, but in the way of things that have been made and used and remain themselves through the using. She would have liked you, Celeste said, still looking at the garden. I did not say anything for a moment. You don't know that. She would have liked anyone who looked at a brooch with a hairline crack and thought about who wore it and what it meant to them, she said. She thought attention was a form of love, the rarer kind. I went back to work. The room was very quiet, and outside the November trees were bare, and Celeste Ravenshaw sat in her corner chair and did not leave, and I did not ask her to. There was a day at the estate vineyard which I had not expected. She mentioned it almost as an afterthought. The Ravenshaw property included a small vineyard 40 minutes from the main estate. Not a commercial concern, but a family one, tended by people who had tended it for 3 generations, and she was going on Sunday to check on the late season work, and I was welcome to come if I wanted air. I said yes, because I did want air, and also because I wanted to see what she was like in a place where the walls weren't watching. She was different in the open, not unrecognizable, not without her quality of composure, but less braced. She walked the rows with her hands in her coat pockets and her face turned up to the pale November sky, and talked about the vines with the easy knowledge of someone who had listened to them being talked about since childhood. The grapes were in, the year had been dry but not too dry. The old vines along the south wall had produced something the keeper said was worth keeping patient about. I mostly listened. I knew nothing about viticulture. I knew a fair amount about watching someone be at home in a place, and she was at home here in a way she was not in the estate's formal rooms, genuinely, without performing it. We sat on a low stone wall at the end of one of the rows, in the pale afternoon sun, and she poured 2 glasses of something from the previous year that the keeper had produced from somewhere with the specific generosity of people who think their wine should be shared. My mother used to say that the vineyard was the only honest thing the Ravenshaws owned, Celeste said, because you cannot rush it, and you cannot pretend the results are something they aren't. It sounds like she said a lot of true things, I said. She did, Celeste said. I spent the first few years after she died wishing she'd said more of them. Now I think she said exactly enough, and I'm still learning what they meant. I looked at my wine glass, which was reflecting the pale sky and the stripped vineyard, and a version of me that was slightly warmer than usual, sitting in November sun in a place I had no reason to be and every reason to be glad of. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "Why are you—" I stopped. "Why do you keep coming to my studio? There's enough space in the estate to set up a proper workspace. Peers could bring things to you. You don't need to drive across the city twice a week to sit in my workroom." She looked at the vineyard rows. "No?" she said. "So why?" A pause that had the weight of something considered. "Because in your workroom," she said, "you are entirely yourself. You don't adjust. You don't moderate. You look at an object and you say exactly what you see about it, and you work on it with your full attention, and you are completely honest about what you can and cannot do." She looked at me then, directly, with that storm gray clarity. "I spend a great deal of my life in rooms where no one is entirely themselves. I find yours restful, in the way that real things are restful." I held that for a moment. "You could just say you like the company," I said. The almost smile. This time, it committed slightly further. "I like the company," she said. The vineyard keeper came back with another glass to top us up, and Celeste let him, and the November afternoon stretched out around us, gold and bare and quietly fine. I met Viviana Cross at a charity board meeting I attended in my capacity as collection consultant, which was an official role I had now and a business card that said so, which I still slightly couldn't believe when I looked at it. Viviana had a face like a magazine spread, beautiful in a way that was comprehensive, studied, aware of its own angles. She knew exactly how she appeared from every vantage, and she deployed this knowledge the way some people deploy location in a negotiation. She had done whatever kind of background check was available to a woman of her connections, which was apparently quite thorough, because when we were introduced, she said, with a smile that missed warmth by a precise and deliberate margin, "The jewelry consultant. I've heard about you." "Liora Bennett," I said. "Collection consultant." She said, in a way that made collection consultant sound like an interesting euphemism. "Celeste mentioned you. She didn't mention how charmingly unassuming you were." "She mentioned me?" I said, because I could not help it and immediately regretted not being able to help it. "We're very close," Viviana said. "Have been for years. Our families have certain—" She turned a champagne flute in her fingers with an ease that was its own statement. "Expectations in common." I understood what she was saying. She intended me to understand it. I looked at her calmly and said, "The Ravenshaw collection is exceptional. Some of the Georgian pieces in particular are among the finest I've worked with. It's genuinely the most significant work I've had access to. I'm sure you're very talented," she said gently, "but I want you to understand something. Celeste has a history of finding people who are—" She searched with the air of someone who had already found the word and was performing the search. "Unconventional? It's a particular phase for her. It passes. She always comes back to what makes sense." I held her gaze. "Thank you for the context." Her smile adjusted slightly, the way things adjust when an expected result doesn't come. "You don't seem bothered," she said. "I'm very bothered," I said honestly, "but not by what you'd expect." I found Celeste 20 minutes later across the room, in conversation with a board member, giving him the full precision of her attention in a way that managed to be both genuine engagement and a very slight performance of patience, and she saw me from across the room with that quality she had of knowing where things were without appearing to look. She made her way to me eventually and said, "You spoke with Viviana." "I did." A pause. "What did she say?" "That you have a history of finding unconventional people and coming back to what makes sense afterward." A pause that was slightly longer and had more in it. "Is it true?" I asked. She looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize, the one where she was making a decision about what she actually meant to say, rather than what was available to say. "I have spent a significant portion of my adult life doing what makes sense," she said. "I'm currently reconsidering whether that was wisdom or a very long, very expensive habit." I couldn't find an answer for that. I was not sure one was required, but when Viviana watched us from across the room with those careful, assessing eyes, I noticed that Celeste did not turn toward her. She stayed exactly where she was, facing me, present. Odette Ravenshaw arrived at the estate on a Tuesday when I was alone in the archive room, having been dropped off by peers an hour before and left to work through the morning with a thermos of good coffee and the pleasant silence of a room full of objects that had outlasted everyone who'd ever worried about them. The footsteps coming down the hall were not Piers's measured approach or Celeste's particular tempo. They were lighter, more deliberate, with a quality of intention I felt before I identified the source. Odette was a small woman with an enormous presence, assembled rather than dressed in layers of silk that moved when she moved, but not as much as real silk ought to, which suggested considerable structural engineering. She stood in the doorway and looked at me with a smile that bore no relation to pleasure. "Miss Bennett?" she said. "How industrious." "Mrs. Ravenshaw," I said, setting down my tools. I did not stand up, which I noted as a choice, and which she also noted as a choice. I wasn't told to expect a visit. "Oh, I don't make appointments in my own house," she said, coming into the room as though it were hers, which in some version of her imagination it remained. "I find surprises so instructive." She looked at the pieces on my work table and at my tools, and at the documentation I was maintaining. Extraordinary, the trust Celeste places in someone so new. "I've been working with the collection for 3 months, I said. "And I have professional credentials in jewelry restoration and historical assessment, if you'd like to review them." Of course, she said dismissively. She picked up a small silver dish from the edge of the table and turned it in her hands with a proprietary ease that made my skin tighten. "People are talking, you know, about Celeste's new consultant." The pause before consultant was architecture, not hesitation. "The girl from the Gala, the necklace incident." "The incident in which I found and returned a misplaced piece," I said. She set the dish down and looked at me with something that was closer to genuine appraisal. "Let me be direct," she said. "My stepdaughter has always been susceptible to novelty. You are a novelty. Skilled, honest. I'll grant you that. And you are useful in a difficult moment. But Celeste's world has requirements that have nothing to do with either skill or honesty. Alliances, continuity, a certain..." She looked briefly at my clothes, at my workmanlike flat shoes, at my wrists without decoration. Match. "You're telling me to leave," I said. "I'm telling you to be realistic before you're embarrassed," she said. Isn't that kinder? I thought for a moment of the vineyard in November sun, of Celeste's voice saying I liked the company with 1 degree more of commitment than the almost smile had ever managed, of the way she sat in my studio workroom as though she could breathe there. "Thank you," I said, with the same neutral courtesy I had given Viviana. "I'll take that under advisement." Odette left. I sat for a while and looked at the Georgian silver I was meant to be cataloging. Then I picked up my tools and went back to work, because the work was real and was in front of me and I was good at it. But I was shaken, not because Odette had said anything I hadn't already thought. Because she had said it out loud, in a room full of things that had outlasted generations. And it had sounded true. There is a specific kind of warmth in a penthouse at night. In winter, when the city below is lit and wet, and 60 floors of nothing separate you from the ground. I was there ostensibly to review a set of portrait miniatures too delicate to transport safely. The drive up had been quiet, Piers navigating the city rain with his usual efficiency, and I had spent it telling myself that this was a working visit, that professional consultants visited clients' homes all the time, that the fact that I had changed my clothes twice before leaving the studio was entirely about professional presentation. The penthouse was glass and carefully chosen silence, and the view was extraordinary. The city spread below like a scattered handful of lights at different depths, rain making the distances bleed into each other, and I stood at the window for a moment that was too long. When I moved here, Celeste said behind me, I stood at that window for an hour. She appeared beside me with 2 mugs of tea. Plain mugs, I noticed, not china, which seemed deliberate in a home that could have produced anything. And her voice had the dry quality she used when she was being honest about something she found slightly absurd. I thought, this is what it looks like to have done the thing, whatever the thing is. Then I realized I was entirely alone and the view didn't care about me at all. Did that help? I asked, taking the mug. Not immediately, she said. Eventually I learned to find the view enough on its own terms, without needing it to reflect anything back about me. We sat at her dining table, the miniatures between us under the document lamp she had set up. She knew every subject, women of the Ravenshaw line going back 5 generations, each portrait smaller than a playing card, each one a whole world compressed into an oval of ivory and careful paint. She told me their stories with the particular quality of her attention, the slight lean forward, the hands near but not touching. And I listened and took notes and looked at these small contained faces of women who had been real and were now reduced to this, and still somehow insisting on being known. At some point, the tea cooled and neither of us reached for it. At some point, the portrait discussion stopped, and we were simply talking, the way people talk when they have stopped performing comfort for each other and simply have it. I don't know which of us moved. I think it was the quality of the silence that moved, shifted, became a different kind of thing. What I remember is that her face was very close, and her eyes were that particular storm gray that was no longer deciding but had decided, and the space between us resolved. The first kiss was careful, almost a question, with the particular delicacy of something first. The second was not a question at all. I don't know how much time passed. I know that when I became aware of the city again, the rain on the glass had shifted from one kind of evening to another kind, and Celeste was holding my face in both hands with an expression I had never seen on her before. Present, open, uncertain in a way she was usually too composed to allow. Something far below her usual architecture of self. I have to tell you something, she said. All right, I said. Fastening the necklace around your neck at the gala, she said. It wasn't only strategy. I looked at her. I told myself it was a statement, she said. A protection, a claim on your safety. And it was those things. But the pause was real, not performed. There are 100 ways I could have defused that situation without touching you. I chose the one that required me to stand close behind you and put my hands at your neck. She was looking at me with absolute steadiness. That was the first purely selfish thing I had done in years. I need you to know that. I thought about the corridor, the necklace, cold and extraordinary, on a table where it had no business being. The choice I had made, which was not a calculated choice, but simply the only available choice when you are the particular person you are, and how that small, honest act had led, through a series of rooms and conversations and silences, to here. I need to tell you something too, I said. She waited. I went home that night, convinced I was going to be a footnote, I said. The girl who found the necklace. A brief, interesting incident in the story of Celeste Ravenshaw, filed and moved on from. I've been telling myself that's the most I could be in your world, with your life, for months, because it's safer than the alternative. The alternative, she said carefully. Believing you might actually choose me, I said. Not as a novelty, not as a temporary, unconventional palate cleanser. As someone you want in your life because of who I am, not because of what I did one night in a corridor. She took a breath. Something shifted in her face, slow and significant. Liora, she said, and my name in her mouth sounded different than it ever had. Not a label, not a professional address. A deliberate, tender claim. I have been choosing you since the moment you told a room full of people who wanted to believe otherwise that you found a necklace in a corridor and were returning it. And you said it steadily, simply, like the truth was enough. She stopped, tried again. It was not a fascinating story. I was not interested in the drama of it. I was looking at the only entirely honest person in a room full of performance, and I could not look away. I kissed her again because that felt like the right answer to that. The happiness lasted 6 weeks of quiet and working visits and a long dinner at a small restaurant that Celeste had chosen, because it was not on any list and the pasta was made by the owner's mother on Tuesdays, which felt, she said, like the kind of information worth knowing. Odette, regrouping, was patient. Patience was clearly her weapon of choice. The Ravenshaw annual estate auction was a significant event, held at the family's own auction house. A beautiful, cold room with high ceilings and the smell of old wood and serious money, and the particular ambient competence of rooms designed for the exchange of expensive things. I was there as collection consultant, which gave me a seat at the margins of the room. Celeste was at the front. I had told her that morning that I loved the poster from the 1920s auction in the entryway, and she had looked at me as though I had said something important, and I had felt good for the entire drive over. It was the post-event reception where Odette moved her pieces. Viviana had a gift for timing that Odette had apparently recognized and cultivated. She waited until the room was full, and I was standing alone near the back wall with a glass of sparkling water. Celeste was speaking with the auction house director, necessary and temporary, and then said, in a voice designed to carry precisely as far as she intended, Miss Bennett, I've heard you've been quite thorough in your access to the Ravenshaw estate. Personal access, I mean beyond the professional scope. She smiled. I do hope you understand that Celeste's enthusiasms tend to be expensive hobbies, rather than genuine engagements. She's historically very generous with temporary arrangements. The room did what rooms do. The nearest conversation slowed. Attention arranged itself. I was aware of eyes. I was aware of the particular texture of expensive silence, the way the wealthy watch humiliation with the specific quality of people who have practiced not appearing to watch. I thought about everything Celeste had said about what she believed about herself, that she was unsustainable, that she wore people down. I thought about Odette's voice in the estate archive. Be realistic before you're embarrassed. I thought about being small, being replaceable, being a footnote. I set down my glass. I'm going to say something, I said, not loudly, but with a clarity I had not known I had until it was needed. And I'd like people to hear it. The room adjusted. My name is Liora Bennett, I said. I'm a jewelry restoration consultant. 3 months ago, I found the Moonfall Diamond necklace in a service corridor at the Ravenshaw Foundation Gala, and I returned it. Because that is what you do when you find something that doesn't belong to you. I was accused of theft by people who found my guilt more useful than my honesty, and I was protected by Celeste Ravenshaw because she is a woman who looks at evidence rather than convenience. I looked at Viviana. I looked at Odette, who had appeared somewhere in the middle distance with an expression of careful neutrality that was doing significant structural work. Since then, I have been doing my job with honesty and with care, I said. I have also and here I felt the pause as a choice, a deliberate and considered stepping forward into territory I had spent months telling myself I wasn't allowed. Fallen in love with Celeste Ravenshaw, not with her name, not with her estate, or her collection or her position, with a woman who has been surrounded her entire life by people who confused her resources with her value, and who is the most genuinely loyal and deeply honest person I have met, and who deserves better than what this room has always been willing to give her. I heard a sound from across the room and turned. Celeste was standing 10 feet away. She had come from somewhere in the room, drawn by some quality of the silence or by my voice or by something else, and she had been standing there for enough of that speech to have heard most of it. Her face was doing the thing it did when it was working very hard not to shift, and was not entirely succeeding. Something around her eyes, something in the set of her mouth that was not the controlled expression, but the one beneath it. The room between us was full of expensive, witnessing silence. I walked toward her. She did not move, but something in her posture opened, fractionally, the way a door that has been long closed yields at last to a familiar and patient pressure. "I told a room full of people I was in love with you," I said when I reached her. "I should probably have told you first. I'm sorry about the order." She looked at me for one long moment. "Catastrophically brave," she said, "and completely accurate." And then her hand found mine, and she did not look around to see who was watching. The legal reckoning came over the following months, carefully and thoroughly. Odette's involvement with the placement of the Moonfall, once the security footage was properly reviewed and the financial records of a specific member of the event staff were traced, led to the kind of settlement negotiation that involves many lawyers and one very long silence on a telephone line that Celeste described afterward with the exhaustion of someone who has held a form for 12 continuous hours. She came to my studio afterward, which had become a habit we had not named, and I made tea in my plain studio mugs, and she sat on the stool at my workbench and was allowed to not perform anything at all. Viviana Cross relocated, which I understood was a mutual arrangement of the kind that wealthy people make when the alternative is sustained awkwardness in shared rooms. The studio thrived, which still surprised me when I thought about it in certain lights, though June said the surprise was misplaced because I had always been exceptionally good and had simply been operating on a street that insufficient people walked down. Word had spread, partly because the Ravenshaw collection was now in our portfolio, which opened specific and significant doors, and partly because I was genuinely good in a way that had always been true and was now more widely known. I hired an assistant. Her name was Rosa, and she had the quality I recognized from my own beginning. The patience of someone who found genuine comfort in precision and small, beautiful things. I taught her to use the loop and the burnishing cloth and the language of old metal, and she was a careful and quick student. And it turned out that having someone to teach made me understand my own craft differently. The way explaining a thing shows you its shape. June met someone at a library book sale who was everything she had categorically declared she did not want in theory, and whom she turned out to want enormously in practice. They were disgustingly happy together, in a way that June would have mocked relentlessly in a novel and appeared to have absolutely no defenses against in real life. She told me, with great dignity, that love was an irrational system, and she had decided to stop optimizing it. I pointed out that I had told her something very similar approximately 6 months earlier, and she had called it poetic avoidance. She acknowledged this magnanimously. Celeste gave up 3 rooms of the estate's closed east wing, had them opened and aired and refurnished in her particular way, careful, austere in a warm sense, full of good light. One of them had been set up when she showed me, with a work table and an adjustable lamp and a set of tools very like the ones in my studio, arranged with the precision that suggested she had thought about how I arranged mine. She showed me this room without ceremony or preface. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. "This is for me," I said. "If you'd like it," she said. "I would like it," I said. She nodded in the way she still sometimes nodded when something mattered more than she let her voice convey. And then I went in and looked at the table and the lamp and the arrangement of tools, And I thought about everything that had led from a corridor in a hotel to a room in an estate with my name on it, in everything except the actual label. And I thought, this is what it feels like when someone knows exactly who you are and makes space for precisely that. The Ravenshaw Foundation Winter Gala was held in January, and it was extraordinary in a different way than the first one I had attended. The first one being extraordinary in the way that disasters are extraordinary, sudden and galvanizing and likely to be discussed for years. This one was held in the estate's own formal ballroom, which had been restored and prepared with a care that showed. The room had been dark for a long time after Celeste's mother died, and opening it again had been a decision made with the same quality of deliberateness she brought to everything that mattered. It was lit with 1,000 small warm lights, the kind that make a room feel held rather than illuminated, and the guests were different from the first gala. These were the foundation's artists and curators and patrons, people who were there because they believed in the thing the late Mrs. Ravenshaw had believed in, that beauty was a form of survival, and that some people had been systematically prevented from it. I wore a dress that was mine. I had bought it for the occasion, in a deep blue that I had held in the dressing room light and known immediately. And when Celeste had seen it, she had looked at it for a long moment and said nothing at all, which I had come to understand was her highest register of response. I was there as her partner. There was no other word she used, no qualifier, no modulating phrase. When she introduced me to anyone who required introduction, she said partner, and the word was entirely without apology. Before the gala began, in the quiet dressing room adjacent to the main hall, she came to me with the moonfall in her hands, the platinum chain, the crescent of falling diamonds. In the warm lamplight of the dressing room, it was softer than it had been under the gala's chandeliers, which was what good light does, shows you the thing as it actually is, rather than as it performs. "May I?" she said. I turned. Her hands lifted the chain, and her fingers found the clasp, the same practiced ease, and the weight settled against my collarbone. And her fingers stayed as they always stayed, one breath longer than strictly necessary. Not because she needed to, because there was no audience requiring a statement, just the clasp, and my neck, and her hands in the quiet of a room where no one was watching. "The first time you put this on me," I said, looking at her in the mirror, "I spent 3 days trying to understand why." "What did you conclude?" she asked. "That you were too complicated for a quick answer," I said, which turned out to be the correct conclusion for a different reason than I expected. She came around to face me and tilted her head and said, "Would you like the actual answer? The version I know now, rather than the one I told myself at the time?" "I would like the actual answer very much," I said. "I'd been carrying it in a separate case for the entire evening," she said, "planning to display it for exactly 1 hour and then put it away. I was careful with it. I'm always careful with it." A pause. "When you were standing in that ballroom, with your hands open, and your dress borrowed, and half the room deciding your guilt, and you simply kept saying, 'I found it,' and I was returning it, quietly, steadily, like the truth was a thing that would eventually land. Something happened." She looked at me with total steadiness. "I wasn't thinking about strategy. I put it on you because I wanted everyone who had just watched you be made small to see you lit. It was not a plan. It was a reflex. It was the most honest thing I had done in years." My eyes stung abruptly and inconveniently, and I blinked. "You are," she said, with the precision she reserved for things she was entirely certain of, "the most honest person I have met. Not because you're incapable of concealment, because you've chosen not to make it a habit. In my world, that is not a small thing. That is a rare and specific and extraordinary thing, and I have been slowly learning how to treat it like the gift it is." "I'm also," I said, because some reflex in me would always reach for the leveling, the equalizing, The honest, small detail set against the large feeling. The person who spent 6 months convinced I was going to be a footnote. "I know," she said. "I noticed. I waited for you to stop." "Did I stop?" "You stopped," she said, "when you stood up in a room full of people and said you were in love with me. That was not footnote behavior." I looked at her, at those storm gray eyes that had stopped deciding long ago and simply were, at the warmth in her face that she no longer caught and held still, but let exist where it had a right to exist, in the open air between us. "I'm still in love with you," I said, in case you needed the confirmation. "I do not need it," she said, "but I am glad of it." And then, with a warmth that was a permission, something she was allowing herself, something she had stopped taxing herself for. "I love you, Liora." I had heard many things in ballrooms and private lounges and glass-walled penthouses and cold estate rooms. Declarations of social purpose, sentences designed to position and manage and maneuver. I had never heard 3 words arrive with that particular quality of settled certainty. Not triumphant, not performing. Simply true. The way a clasp closes when both sides are made for the same thing. The moonfall was cold at my collarbone. Her hands were warm. "Come on," she said softly, and offered her hand, and I took it. The ballroom was lit like a room in a dream that someone very careful had constructed and maintained. The Foundation's artists moved through it with the ease of people who had been welcomed rather than auditioned. And the music was live and imperfect and beautiful in the way live music always is, and the chandeliers were the estate's own, heavy with age and careful maintenance, throwing light in the particular way of old things that have survived enough to know what they're doing. We walked in together, and there were looks, as there always were with Celeste. The particular attention that powerful women receive in rooms of people who have complicated feelings about power and women. But there was also something else this time. The way she held my hand as though I were not a phase or a novelty or an unconventional interlude, but a fact about her life. The way she introduced me with the full weight of her attention behind the introduction, so that the introduction felt like a declaration by virtue of how much it meant. June caught my eye from across the room. She was there with her person, and she was wearing an expression of such complete and undisguised delight that I had to look away quickly before I did something embarrassing. She gave me a small, emphatic nod, which was June's version of a standing ovation, and turned back to her own evening. At some point, Celeste drew me toward the tall windows that looked out over the estate's winter garden. Bare-branched trees in the early dark, boxwood hedges that held their shape all year, the garden's bones clear in January with nothing to soften or obscure them. And beyond the formal beds, the outline of a structure I had been told about. Glass and iron, Victorian, dark with years of closure. "It was a greenhouse," she said. "My mother kept it. She grew things there in winter, camellias mostly. She said flowers that bloom when everything else has gone dormant are the bravest things alive." I looked at the outline of it in the winter dark. The iron frame, the dark glass, the shape of something that had been tended and then wasn't, and had been waiting in its patient structural way. "We should restore it," I said. She turned to look at me. "I know nothing about horticulture," I said. "Genuinely nothing, not even which end of a camellia to plant first. But I know how restoration works. You assess what's there. You understand what it was meant to do, and you bring it back without pretending it hasn't been through time. And you know what she planted. And Rosa has a cousin who does landscape work and has been looking for an interesting project." I paused. "It's not an immediate thing. It's a project. A long one." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the first snow of January had begun in earnest. Small and even, drifting past the glass in the particular way of something that has decided. "You've been here 6 months," she said. And you're planning the greenhouse. I plan things, I said. It's a quality I have. The warmth in her face deepened. Not the almost smile, not the guarded thing. The real one, which I had now seen enough times to know and still felt each time as something that required a moment to receive properly. Not dazzling, but deeply specific, meant for exactly me and arriving exactly where I was. Yes, she said. Let's restore the greenhouse. She turned back toward the room. The music had shifted to something slower, and the ballroom's guests had adjusted to it, drawing together in the gentle, gravitational way of people at ease at the end of an evening they hadn't wanted to end. The chandeliers threw their old, careful light across dancers and conversations, and the particular quality of a room that was full of people who were genuinely glad to be where they were. Celeste looked at me with those decided, certain eyes and offered her hand, and I took it, and we walked back toward the music and the warm light. The Moonfall Diamond was cold against my throat, that small and extraordinary pressure. A crescent of falling stones that had been falling since before I was born and would go on falling long after. It was cold, and it was her mother's, and it was mine to wear for this evening because she had decided it was. And that decision was not a collar, not a claim arranged for strategic purposes, not a public statement manufactured in a crisis. It was a promise, the most honest kind, not made in a moment of grand declaration, but accumulated quietly over months, in workroom silences and vineyard afternoons and cold estate rooms, in things said and things not said, in the particular way she had of staying exactly where she was when she could have been anywhere else. Her hand was warm. The snow was coming down outside, patient and even, the way things fall when they have decided where they're going. The foundation's guests moved and talked and listened to music in a room that had been dark for years and was full of light now, because she had decided it was time, because I had said let's and she had said yes. I was not a footnote. I was not a phase or an unconventional interlude or a novelty that would eventually run its course. I was the woman standing at the center of an evening like this one, holding the hand of a person who had seen exactly who I was and had chosen again and again, carefully and with full understanding of what the choice cost and what it meant to stay. The music played on. The snow continued outside, falling as things fall when they have decided. And we danced.